Sustainable Ag Society member. I'm pleased to announce Katie Jantzen and Tom Thomas here. They're going to talk about no-till vegetable and the pros and cons, and we're probably going to wind up with a lot of questions about, hey, what about this and what about that?
Yeah.
And that's what we're here for.
Yep.
All right, so I'll turn it over to you two.
Okay.
We're going to do brief introductions so that you kind of understand our context, and I'm sure more of that will come out in the question and answer. I'm Katie Jantzen. I farm near Plymouth, which is west of Beatrice, which is south of Lincoln. And I have a small diversified vegetable operation. I sell primarily through a CSA subscription program and some at a local farmer's market, and then I also keep honeybees. I'm coming up on my 6th year of farming there. Previously, I've worked on other farms or interned at other places, and so I have some degree of ag experience in Nebraska, Indiana, and Virginia primarily.
I'm Tom Thomas. I live in Orleans, Nebraska. I have a big garden. Back in the 60s and 70s, we used to have about 10, 15 acres of vegetables, and we had a greenhouse, raised bedding plants out in Lincoln County. Helped get the farmers market started in North Platte, and we sold mostly sweet corn, melons, pumpkins, things like that. Right now I'm retired and pretty much have just the garden that I work with, and I use mostly mulch in the garden, but we'll get into more specifics as we get along with it.
So the format of this talk, we have a few slides, just basic stuff, so we're kind of all on the same page with what we're talking about. But we want to leave a lot of time for discussion and questions at the end because it's rare that we have someone with Tom's experience and knowledge with us, so we really want to take advantage of that. So to start off with, we want to ask, what exactly does no-till mean? Because this looks different in different contexts. And so some people will define that as absolutely no soil disturbance. Other people will say, well, I just don't use such and such an implement, but the basic premise is that the less you disturb the soil and the more residue you can leave on top, the greater diversity of soil biology you'll have and less chances for erosion. Did you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, and of course, conventional no-till means Roundup, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about organic, or at least not using chemicals as a means. And when I'm talking about mulching as opposed to no-till, I'm talking about organic matter, hay, straw, grass clippings, leaves, these kinds of things, as opposed to plastic mulch. And I use plastic mulch sometimes in trails, things like that. But mostly the idea is to keep organic matter on the surface and let it feed the soil from the top down.
So we have a series of pictures here because we recognize that this talk is about vegetables specifically, but this question applies to a lot of different crops at a lot of different scales. And you can farm vegetables in a window box planter or on hundreds of acres. And so we wanted to provide a little bit of description here of the different scales and the different tools that would be used in a tillage operation versus a no-till operation, because so this talk is not set up to be a heated debate or anything. We wanted to explain both till and no-till in their different contexts. So what we have here are two examples of what is definitely tillage equipment. You've got a standard plow, which would be used in a larger scale. This is a rotary plow, which would be used on a small scale behind a walk-behind tractor. So that would be used for establishing beds generally in a raised bed system for vegetable crops. Then you've got a disc for field scale, and then the smaller scale equivalent would be a rototiller. Both of these would also obviously be tillage implements. Then you come to these two here. This is a turbo tiller, which is often used in no-till field crop systems. So it's kind of tillage, kind of not. It's like a disc, but the disc blades are straighter, so you're not really moving as much dirt. And the idea here would be to kind of chop up some of your residue, and then the roller on the back and leaves you with a finer seed bed, and you're really only disturbing the top inch or two of soil. The small scale vegetable equivalent would be the tilther there in the corner, which is this adorable little, it's like a mini rototiller that has, it's powered by a hand drill, which I think is very cute. I don't have one, but I think it's very cute. Tilther, Tilther. Johnny's sells them. I'm sure you can find them other places as well. And the tilther, that little thing, is often used by no-till vegetable growers because you need to have some way to incorporate soil amendments. And so the idea is because the tines are about that big, you're really not moving or disturbing a lot of soil. And then this here is a chisel plow, and the smaller scale equivalent is a broad fork. Both of those would be used. This would not really be used so much in a no-till field system, but a broad fork is used regularly in no-till small-scale vegetable production. The idea there is to not really invert the soil, but to break it a little bit to allow water and air into it.
Yeah, these tines go down 12 to 18 inches, depending on the broad fork you've got. So they just put them down in and then rock it back, and you open up the soil a little bit, let some space for air and water to get down in.
The idea there is you're moving the soil, but you're essentially putting it right back where it was. So
Right.
You're not really disturbing any soil structure, essentially. So the whole point of this is just to say there are different scales that this question applies at. And then along with, maybe this is obvious, maybe not, but all the other implements that we did not include pictures of would be cultivation equipment. So if you are tilling, you're generally doing that to control weeds then during the season if you're not doing ground prep or bed prep. And so there's all kinds of really fun tools for that, like tine weeders, finger weeders, basket weeders, sweeps of all kinds. You've probably seen something like that, whether it's an old field cultivator or whatever. So there exist many options for weed management in the tillage side of things. When you get to no-till, and this was what Tom was talking about, you have other options. Top center there, chemicals of various sorts are what is probably the easiest, what people will go to on a larger scale if you're not concerned with organic. If you are, then you have to get creative with some of these other options here. So Tom already mentioned mulch. This is plastic mulch, like what he was talking about. In the middle over there, looks like straw, so that's an organic mulch. You can also manage weeds by roller crimping cover crops, so that would be a small scale option. There's also very, very large roller crimpers at field scale. And then you can play with fire as well. So use flame weeders to get rid of weeds. Any other thoughts on that, Tom?
Well, while we got the picture up here, this does look a lot like straw. Okay. One caveat on straw, there's a big difference between wheat, rye, oats for straw, in that oats are not strong competitors as compared to wheat or rye. So when you get the straw, you get some seed with it. If you use rye, it's very persistent and aggressive, and it will actually take over your crop. It can get up that high. So if you're going to use straw, stick with oats in the garden and for vegetable crops. And I would caution you to get your straw from an organic farmer, because it is very common these days to use Roundup to kill whatever's green in the field before they combine. And the reason for that is that you get your ration of Roundup in your Cheerios. So, no, there is a limit residue allowance for Roundup in food. And that's the way you get it. They're spraying the crop while the oats, wheat, barley are standing there, and then it burns everything down, then it can go through and combine it. So that would stay on your straw. You don't want that in your garden. So if you can get it from an organic farmer, straw is okay.
So a couple of benefits here with no-till. We already talked about soil structure when we were talking about the implements, but better soil structure, you also have better biological capacity and increased microbial diversity if you're not constantly churning up the soil and breaking up those soil clods that you would have there that are allowing for greater biological activity. You'll have better water retention and infiltration, which is the reason why a lot of row crop farmers in my area have moved towards no-till. We have some capacity for irrigation, but not everyone has water, and so whatever you can do to retain water, that's definitely a plus. If you're adding organic mulches, you're going to be adding organic matter and organic nutrients, so that's helpful. And then also you're probably leaving soil on the surface, and so you're going to reduce wind and water erosion as well.
Yep. If you've ever stood out in your garden in the middle of a rainstorm, which only turkeys and really inquisitive gardeners do, and watch what happens when the rain hits your soil, you will see the compaction that takes place, the sealing of the surface, and pretty soon you have runoff. Just having a little bit of residue on top makes an altogether different physical protection for that soil. So the mulch giving you the improved soil structure, it reduces the destruction of your soil structure by simply the impact of water. And then you do get the better infiltration and reduced erosion. But you can take a look out the window and see what happens when those raindrops are hitting the soil in your garden, and then have one patch that's covered with a mulch, one that's not, and then later on go out there and stick your fingers down in if you can. And I've worked with some heavy clay soils that would really get compacted just from the rain. Sandy soils, you can do a lot, get away with a lot.
There's also some drawbacks to no-tilling.
Yep.
On a smaller scale, market garden, vegetable cropping scale, a lot of compost has been added. That's kind of been a fad that's really taken off in the last, people have been doing it for a long time, but there were a few people that wrote books and got famous about just add a ton of compost all the time to your beds. So that's how a lot of no-till is accomplished on a smaller scale. Now that that's been going on long enough, there's been some concerns about whether or not that's actually good for your soil. Mm-hmm. You often wind up with a lot of phosphorus. You end up with an imbalance in your nutrients then. Lots of phosphorus can lead to runoff, leads to eutrophication, lots of bad things there. You've also got a lot of soluble salts in compost, and so that can increase the alkalinity, so then you've thrown off your pH. So there's concerns about the main way that no-till has been accomplished in smaller scale applications. Also, if you're leaving all this residue on top, like we mentioned, you're going to have trouble running a precision seeder along your bed. So that's why people would add a lot of compost just on top of that, or if you're going to leave that, you're going to have to do transplants, which is fine for certain crops if you're doing tomatoes or peppers or anything, but it's really hard to transplant a carrot, for example. So you can't really run a seeder through for small seeded things on a small scale for vegetable crops.
Yep.
This is also a real challenge if you're dealing with perennial weeds, like bindweed, which is my least favorite. Things like dandelion, quackgrass, there's other things too that could cause headaches with this. There's no real way. If you're trying to avoid chemicals, that's a real challenge to deal with.
Yep.
And then if, especially at a field scale, you do get erosion, you don't have a good way to fix that. If you've got some rills, you can't really just disc that and reshape the ground a little bit if you're trying to not disturb the soil.
Okay. Might as well go to the next one.
So on the other side of things, if you are tilling, there are some definite benefits to that. And I was just talking with someone over lunch who pointed out that if you're flood irrigating, you need to be maintaining those ridges to make that work. So no-till is really difficult in that situation. If you're doing organic vegetables at a larger scale, this can be a little more practical. About your only other option then would be if you're going to try and plant into rolled cover crops, and that's going to require using probably just larger seeded items like pumpkins, beans, sweet corn. It'd be really hard to do large scale organic carrots no-till, for example. That would be quite a challenge. You also don't have to worry about finding mulch or other inputs. You don't have to worry about finding compost. And you can, with tillage, manage weeds a little better if they do get started. In a no-till system, it's really hard to deal with humongous weeds, but you can run some pretty aggressive sweeps through a larger scale field or something if you've got bigger weeds.
Yep. Yeah, and she mentioned using the roller crimper to knock things down. There are other ways that you can do it on a larger scale. One of them is to plant a crop like annual rye or buckwheat that will winter kill with a frost, and then early in the spring the residue breaks down. There's not much resistance, and you can rake it off and plant. I've done that after an onion crop in the middle of August, sown it to annual rye. It gets about that high. It freezes and lays down. And I've actually waited until the end of June, 1st of July to plant carrots in that bed. And there is a certain amount of allelopathy in the rye that keeps the weeds down. I only had a few dandelions come up in that bed. I raked it off, planted the carrots, and very few weed problems in that. They're doing it on a larger scale, like I said, with the sweeps, with things like hairy vetch and rye, these kinds of things, undercutting them. But then you do need the bigger equipment to open up a slot to do your planting and those kinds of things. Carrots, if you can grow carrots and lettuce from seed direct, you know, that open soil makes a difference. And if you want to do it earlier in the spring, you rake it off a week ahead of planting so that the soil has a chance to warm up. But that's about all you need to worry about. The small seeded crops. Bigger seeded crops, pretty easy to get along. Transplanting, I've gone to transplanting my sweet corn. Just my wife and I, so I plant 4 hills, 5 plants in the hill in the greenhouse. And then when the corn's that high, I move it out. 4 different varieties, 4 hills of each, and that keeps us going we do three plantings of that. Works real well. Transplanting sweet corn is something that I would recommend if you've got problems with voles or mice that eat the seed when you plant them. That was one of the reasons I do it.
And as always, there's drawbacks to every system. So every time you till, you're going to be burning up some organic matter. You're going to be stirring up the soil and losing some moisture. And every time you're turning up the soil, you are damaging some of the soil structure that's there. And I'll also add, every time you're turning the soil, you're bringing up more weed seeds that are now in that prime germination zone. So if weeds are already a problem, maybe this is something to avoid. Depends on context. Mm-hmm. So this is important. It's important not to get hung up on the ideology of whether tillage or no-till is good or bad. There are a lot of people who get really excited about doing no-till and are insistent upon only doing no-till, and they won't consider anything else, and then they realize, oh, but. So at some point, even in a no-till operation, tillage is probably going to be necessary. So you're probably going to have to do tillage initially to either deal with compaction on a large scale, or if you're on a smaller scale, to build your raised beds that will then be no-till, but you're going to have to do tillage to do that. So both systems, if done well, can improve the soil, and both systems, if done poorly, can degrade the soil. So yields have been shown, it depends on what study you look at, but yields have been shown to be similar in both systems, depending on many other factors that you have to take into account. And cover crops, for example, can be incorporated, no pun intended, in both systems. So there are ways to manage your nutrients, manage your weeds, both ways that can work, and it all depends on your context, which is what we want to talk about.
And like I said, I've been doing mulch as far as establishing the beds. The biggest thing I have to keep out of the bed where it's planting are my feet. When I have my beds laid out, I walk on the same trails year after year after year, and I'm working on beds that are 3 to 4 feet wide. So I can reach down on my knees, I can reach in there and do whatever needs to be done, or stand and do whatever needs to be done. But the soil doesn't get compacted. And I think if you remember that one slide back where she's walking along with that tilther, where she was stepping was that much down, just from the foot compaction. So that makes a difference. The other thing on talking about not tilling, I till the ground about every 5 or 6 years when I dig my potatoes, when I dig my sweet potatoes, when I dig my parsnips. So in the rotation, when I'm digging those, and if I've got some beds close to the neighbor line fence where there's bindweed. So I tend to rotate my sweet potatoes and those kind of crops in those beds on a little bit shorter cycle because I need to work on the bindweed. But so there's a combination going on there.
So we want to talk briefly about what we both do in a little more depth. I have a small market garden. I have about 3/4 of an acre. Most of it operates under a tillage system. Some of it is no-till. So this is not a super great picture, but you can see I've just done a lot of tillage here to prepare trenches for planting potatoes. This is a spring picture. Right behind that is sort of no-till. That's my garlic plot for that year. And so it's got straw mulch on it. And then this is a power harrow, so that would be sort of like a little bit bigger tilther style thing. I've got raspberries and blackberries here, so those are no-till because you can't really till up your raspberry plants. And then farther back, that's where I have the rest of my plot, and then I also have asparagus and rhubarb, which are under a no-till system because you don't really want to till up your perennial plants there either. So I primarily use either hay or straw mulch for those. But all the rest of my plot, that way and this way, uses tillage, and because I am trying to rotate through a lot of crops in a short time frame, depending on what the crop is. If you're going to operate with no-till, you need to have some way to manage all that residue. So on a small scale, often people will cut it down in some way and then put a tarp over it to allow it to break down for several weeks. I don't always have several weeks to wait around. A rototiller can incorporate it in several minutes. I have tried tarping. When I first got this plot ready, we attempted to put tarps over the whole thing, and despite putting every single heavy object we had on the farm, including old payloader tires, they still blew away, and so that did not work in my context. Over here, this is an example of needing to deal with residue no matter what system you're using. I was cleaning up my sweet potato crops this year, and those are all the vines. They did not make it, they fell off the wagon. But you can see a little bit, I have some landscape fabric, which is sort of like a plastic mulch that can be reused. And so that's a different kind of mulching that it's not really putting organic matter back into the soil, but at least it's reducing erosion from various means. couple other things I wanted to say about my particular context. I don't have access to compost. I would like to be able to have that. I think that would be wonderful to have more compost sources in my part of Nebraska. Unfortunately, even if I did have access, I couldn't use it because I have an abundance of phosphorus and potassium already, so adding more compost would not make sense in my context. And then, yeah, I guess the three constraints I'm dealing with in terms of my decision for no-till or till would be compost and the existing nutrient balance, wind, which my garlic this year is just a couple beds over, and I've started tying it down with twine, that mulch, and I've already had to put it back twice just since I planted my garlic a few months ago. So I just have way too much wind to have figured out any good system for organic mulches so far. And then, yeah, my turnover time, I'm trying to put as many crops in a bed as I can, so I'm trying to turn over that bed as often as possible.
Yeah, wind can be a problem. When I was in upstate New York doing research up there on the muck soils, that is basically peat, and it can be anywhere from 2 feet to 12 feet deep, but it's very fluffy. So in order to protect the soil from wind erosion, they would plant beds about as wide as this table, 3 rows of onions or 4 rows of onions, and then in the wheel track, they planted barley at the same time early in the spring. And the barley would come up and eventually get about so tall, and it would provide wind protection for the onions or lettuce that was on the beds. Now, I think you're probably familiar with windbreaks, got a 10-to-1 protection ratio from the height up 10x out. Okay, so if you have a small bed, it doesn't take that much up to give you wind protection. And then they go in there and they just mow it off to get rid of it when it gets high. Interesting thing, it also does when you're using things. I use rows of oats in the garden to do the same thing. When they come up early, you pretty soon have aphids, mites, whatever, likes to feed on your stuff. And then you have something for the ladybugs and the predatory insects to feed on. So you're providing the habitat in your garden, and then by the time you mow it down, your other plants are bigger and they move over. So that can help. An organic way to get some wind protection in and works pretty good. And you're also building soil. As far as what I do with this, oftentimes I will put it on the trails between the beds and just walk it down. And after 2 or 3 years, you get a layer of compost about yay high. And if you want to, you can flip that over onto your bed. But you don't have to move it too far to just get it off the bed, someplace to rot, then you can plant on the bed. If you're doing things like, that need an open bed, lettuce or carrots, that kind of stuff. So
That's all we prepared for a presentation because we want to leave time for discussion, questions. If somebody wants to get the lights, we don't have to stand in the dark anymore.
Yes.
Have you tried using sorghum sedan or some poly cover crop, a mix of sorghum sedan, pearl millet, maybe sunflowers, and then trying to use that as next year's mulch?
Yes, anything that will winter kill works just fine, and it can be like putting your garlic crop in through a dead mulch. I plant mine the first week in November. I'm in the southern part of the state. I don't want it in too early because I don't want it to emerge. But yes, you can do that. And the more things that you mix in there, the better. As long as it'll all winter kill for you. Don't get any grain rye.
On garlic, I often see garlic coming up, a month or 2 after we harvest it.
Yes.
Is there an argument against planting garlic earlier?
I've kind of done the range from early October to mid-November. the first year I was on my current farm, I got it in early, then we had a really warm fall, and it was already this tall, and I was freaking out and tried to throw more mulch on it, because if you get it up too far too early in the fall, you have the potential to burn down a lot of that, and it could just require more resources in the spring then
Right.
to grow again. I didn't seem to have a whole lot of issue with that though, so I probably don't plant it in August, but from that whole range, I haven't had a whole lot of trouble from having it this tall going into winter to not really even sprouted going into winter.
I've had one, I remember one year I did get it planted in mid-October, and it was up like that, and then when it gets down to 20 below, and it's froze stiff, and the wind is 30 mile an hour, it snaps it off, breaks it, but it opens up damage or places for fungi to get in for rot and that kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons why I planted later, so it doesn't come up.
Is it true that garlic only grows so many leaves?
It, yes and no. Depends on the variety that you've got, but depending on when it emerges, it's more day length that determines the number of leaves. When you get to a certain, onions, garlic, most in the allium family in that group, they respond to day length. And then at a certain point, they go from vegetative to reproductive. When they make that switch, then they start filling the bulb. So you can, we used to count the leaves by June 20th, and you could kind of predict what it was going to do for yield on onions in the muck soils in upstate New York. So yes, there is a limit on the leaves. But we were listening to the Mayan fellow talking about trying to grow corn in Nebraska, and they brought some seed up from Belize. They planted it, and he said the stuff grew 20 feet tall and never did flower or set, because it's a day length response too. So a lot of plants are day length sensitive.
So when it comes to termination of cover crops, I'd really like to get better at not resorting to tillage, but I also want to turn over beds really rapidly. And so I oftentimes just do. I have yet to be sold on a roller crimper or
Okay.
anything like that that isn't going to cost me, an arm and a leg. Do you guys have any advice for mid-season termination of cover crops?
More,
Buckwheat on a mower.
yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if you're using a tender crop like buckwheat or even the cowpeas, something like that, they're dicots. You get them cut off below their last axle, and they won't sprout again. Now, annual rye, it will sprout, but for you can use buckwheat or cowpeas and cut them off, mow them off.
So I will do in the summer when I need, like if I'm finishing a spring crop, I know I have a little bit of time in that bed before I plant a fall crop. I'll do buckwheat because it grows quickly and it's really easy to terminate. And so I just drive a push mower across my bed because I'm at a scale where a push mower works. If you're at an even smaller scale and you want a cheap roller crimper, you lay a T-post on the ground and tie ropes to both sides, and then you just step on it. So that's your really cheap roller crimper.
Yeah, I've seen all sorts of variations
So-
of that, or
Okay.
like a 2x4 with a blade on it,
Mhm.
it's the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah,
A scythe.
Sure.
right.
I used to do almost a quarter acre in an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Oh.
Buckwheat was really easy to ride it, soil load.
Well, I guess what I'm learning is I should limit my mid-season cover crops to a more select variety. So I'm using a steel or a still with a blade. I'll cut it back.
Right.
So,
So when I've used things that I should not have in the middle of the season, like sorghum Sudan and lots of other gigantic things,
Yeah.
I've borrowed Riley's BCS with a sickle mower blade on the
Oh.
front.
Okay.
You can chop a lot of stuff down really fast. The problem is then you've got gigantic sorghum Sudan stalks in your plot. So the other option would be a flail mower. You can get very small ones that go on a BCS. I don't have one, but I want one because that would chop up your material a lot better. And then if you're just trying to get residue from your crops out, depending on what scale you're at, I know people who will just kind of pull it out and then rake it off.
Yep.
Otherwise, you'll need some way to kind of pull the whole, well, like that picture of my leaning tower of sweet potato vines. That's something you'll probably have to just manually get out of there. So, because that's low enough, I don't know, a mower won't take that out. You gotta haul it off somehow.
Prairie Road Organic, on their their website, has a nice description of how they do it. They use mulch all the time, and they leave everything in the garden. Early in the spring, they get a rotary mower, and they just set it down low and mow everything. So you're gonna have a little bit of stubble in there, but that takes care of most of it. And then they go in and work their beds and plant, bring in more mulch. And they use a lot of prairie hay. They have one field set aside to produce their mulch for the garden. Prairie hay has a lot of prairie flower and grass seeds in it. But think about the difference in the garden situation and a prairie as far as the germination of the seeds. I've used it, it's great stuff. The weeds were, I shouldn't say weeds, whatever plants would have come up from that seed were never a problem in the garden, except for thistle. Okay. That's the only one.
Another option, if you're trying to terminate something fairly big, is find somebody with a big weed eater that has a saw blade attachment.
Yes.
That's what I use.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a brush cutter.
Okay.
basically,
Yep.
attachment for the end, and then, I mean, what I end up doing is I have a little cultivator attachment pot on the end as well, that's just got those short tines. It sort of breaks up that top of the stuff,
Mhm.
you know, I'd like to not have to do that.
Right. Yes.
Well, just throw out a word of caution, beyond getting organic straw. We bought a farm that had been organic, and they at some point apparently bought wheat straw that had a lot of bindweed seed in it.
Yes.
So bindweed is the bane of my
Yes.
existence now.
Right.
My attempts to heavy mulch have been a huge failure because I feel like it kills everything off and the bindweed just grows
Yep.
through whatever
Right.
I try to mulch with, and it creates this wonderful habitat for bindweed. And
Yep.
not really, I still don't really have a plan other than trying more solarization. We've done a little bit, but it hasn't worked. I think my scale is too small because bindweed roots can go so far, so I'm not really sure. And we decided to abandon the main garden plot and move
Right.
elsewhere. Luckily, we have the land area to do that, but we would love to do more no-till. It's just.
Yep.
Here's the solution from a session from before. They had the talk about pasteurizing the hogs. If you've got a friend who has a hog, they said they'll dig a foot to 2 feet deep to find that bindweed, and it'll destroy it. They said it'll totally destroy everything there, but they will find the bindweed, and you'll get rid of 95% of the bindweed because hogs absolutely love the roots, and they'll go all the way down to the root, 2 feet deep. So find somebody you can borrow a hog, and it'll be torn up for 1 year, but if you can
I
handle
just
not having
promised my
some.
husband I wasn't gonna get any more animals.
Well, hogs are pretty tasty afterward too.
Right.
Vegetarian.
Oh,
Sorry, well.
I know Everett and Ruth,
Well,
yeah, Everett and Ruth at Common Good implemented hogs initially to control their bindweed. So
Right.
that's just part of their rotation, and I don't
Yeah.
remember what it is, but, because you'll,
he's not here, but I'll follow on. That wasn't enough. They went, he developed a neem concoction.
Ah.
That.
what's that?
Neem,
Oh,
yeah, that,
Oil kind of a thing?
yeah, neem oil, which is approved for organic use, and it's a specific concoction, and it's, think of it as a cancer treatment system. And he can provide you the details, he offered it to me. We had the same problem, and I said the only thing that sort of mitigated it, solarization won't work.
no.
was, I planted oats. For whatever reason, I would let oats grow, and in fact, grow to the point all the way through seed to die, and then grow again in
Yes.
the next year, because it's choking a lot of things out.
And if you mix hairy vetch in it, it
Yeah.
really does a good job.
I had a really bad problem with bindweed, and I just kind of didn't know what to do. And so I found that when I let a lot of cover crop sort of go to seed in one of my corners over the middle of the summer, it was hairy vetch and clover and rye, I think is what it was. And towards the end of the autumn, I noticed that the bindweed was less vigorous there. And so it's just
Yeah.
an easier pressure to weed that. And I sort of got in the habit of just letting my cover crops kind of form a little ecosystem that would compete with the bindweed. It doesn't get rid
Right.
of it, but.
We've tried hairy vetch, but it just seems to grow up like hairy vetch. But
Well,
we'll try more
Yeah,
diversity.
yeah, and a combination of hairy vetch and tillage, when the hairy vetch gets high enough, and then till it, and then plant it back to oats and hairy vetch and let it, and buckwheat will grow fast enough to keep it smothered. But it takes several years to get it if you don't have the hogs.
Just borrow a hog. You don't gotta buy one.
Borrow.
Yeah, but they gotta be real pigs, not guinea pigs. They don't. Oh, word of caution on getting things for mulching your garden. Grass clippings work great. I put them on about so thick when it freshened right from the mower. But obviously you don't want anything from someplace where somebody has sprayed herbicide or insecticide or fungicide. So if you can get it, that's fine. Leaves in the fall are great, and on my potato patch, I'll put the leaves on about a foot high, then set the sprinkler, and that'll kind of mat them down. And if I scatter oats over that, if I get it in early enough, the roots will kind of tie it together, keep it from blowing as much. But then in the spring, when I'm ready to plant the potatoes, I just reach down through and push the seed potato into the soil. It's still soft and loose. Push it in and then go on and let the leaves fluff over it. They'll come up when they get ready, right through the leaves. And you're not likely to get herbicides or insecticides from tree leaves. But, the cleaner the source of material, the better. Now, the other thing, as far as soil structure is concerned, I have used leaves several years in a row, and the earthworms love it. And I've had it on really heavy clay soil. When I used to manage the market garden in Boys Town, we did 1/3 of an acre under leaves that deep. We put it on that particular plot because the soil was pretty well eroded, and so it didn't have much organic matter. When those leaves were picked up with a leaf picker, they picked up earthworms with the leaves, so they were pretty well distributed through the leaves. So along about November, the end of November, first part of December, you pull the leaves aside, you'd see a worm here or there, a hole here or there. By the following June, first part, when we're getting ready to plant pumpkins, and you open it up, and you know how ceiling tile with all the little holes is? That's what it looked like. They'd multiplied through the winter, and the worm population had been feeding all through the winter. And this is in Douglas County, so, a fairly normal winter. But the earthworms will do that. However, if you do it several years in a row, earthworms also have a relationship with calcium, and they can tend to make the clay a fairly rigid structure. It's very porous, and the water will go down through it, but it will be not as friable and loose. So if you work the leaves in, we used to work the leaves in and then plant some rye and vetch and then work that in. And then the soil was nice and loose and as you want. But mulch has some of its own characteristic problems that you learn over the years with your soil. Sandy soil, you can get away with anything. Heavy clay soils, you kind of got to watch what you do.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, somebody was starting.
About Edward's neem solution, is he just spraying that on the leaves?
You have to talk to him. And it's been about a year since I talked to him about it. We didn't implement it. because we had space, because it's time consuming, but we had space to just move somewhere else and plant some oats in there and just let that go for
Yep.
2 years.
Yeah.
But, and we had mine in other places, and depending on the crop, sometimes I would just let it, I'd pull it manually, just let it go. There's only so much fighting you can do with Mother Nature,
Yeah.
especially if you're trying to do this profitably.
Right.
If you're doing it as a hobby, have at it.
Yeah. Bindweed for gardeners is a lot like sin for Christians. You know you got to fight it, but it's always going to be there.
You leave me out of this, Tom.
How are people planting their cover crops? Just mostly broadcast, or are we using like small scale seeding equipment, or what's?
I'm at a small enough scale, I get whatever I'm planting in a bucket and walk down the row like this. So
Yep.
I have considered getting a little drop seeder, like what you would for seeding a lawn, because I could get one that's about the width of my bed. But so far, this works fine, because usually I'm not doing a whole lot at one time, because I've got 45 different crops, and so I've got different things in different beds that are ready to turn over at different times. So I'm never really seeding more than a few beds at a time.
Yeah.
So this works just fine.
Yep. I do the same thing, just broadcast it and then take the back of a leaf rake and just get it worked into the top half-inch of soil. And you do that just before rain if you're really good at predicting the weather, or else you get your sprinkler out.
Well, I'll chime in at this point, because they both said this, but I used to do that. I bought the drop seeder, and it's worth it if you're doing it in walkways,
Yeah.
because then the seed's not going everywhere.
Yeah.
And you get a lot more precise, especially with oats.
Mhm.
I have a slightly off-topic question. Do you do this 3/4 acre or whatever on your own?
Yeah, well, yes, with an asterisk. So I don't.
So this is my question. How much time, we primarily raise meat, but we've done a little bit here and there with vegetables and herbs and stuff, and we want to get better at it and add that value to our farm. Time. How much time does it take one person per half acre realistically to do it well?
To do it well, it takes more time than I have. So,
Well, because, we need to plan correctly.
Sure.
Yes.
So for example, I have also an off-farm job that allows me to go to part-time during my busy season. So from mid-April through mid-October, I am working in town 3 days a week, and then I have essentially 3 days on the farm if I want to take a day off, which that doesn't happen with livestock. But so I'm doing.
Also don't actually take days off.
So I'm on my half-ish to 3/4-ish acres. I'm putting about 3 days a week into that, 3 very long days. I'm doing about 30 CSA shares and 1 farmer's market. So I'm probably, if I had more time, I could intensify production on the same amount of land, I think. I could also waste time easily. So my best advice would be figure out either which crops or which marketing avenues you're going to use, and really hone in on, be specific, whether you want to take a whole lot of crops to just one market, figure out how you can optimize your systems to have your production ready to harvest and cool and pack for that one market, or start off with just 3 crops people want, and then get really efficient at those before you try and do some more.
And start small, and start with the things that you really like to eat. And then you can always get bigger, but I'm at the stage where I'm shrinking, getting smaller, because I physically can't handle it as much anymore as I used to. Ruth Stout wrote a book years ago, the No Work Garden book, and I was going to bring a copy to show you, but in there she wrote this back in '74 when she was in her 80s and she was still gardening. And she swore by the mulch system. She'd only been doing it, 40 years or so, so she had it pretty well worked out. But she was 80-something years old, and she's still managing a pretty good-sized garden. So I got that book, read through it again, get some advice from her. But the thing is, if you like to eat it, then, and start
That's
small.
why we do meat.
Pardon me?
That's why we do meat.
Yeah, there you go. Right, yeah.
The USDA will tell you for a small scale, and they've done the studies on it, if you have a basic amount of equipment, 1 acre, about 40 hours a week.
Okay.
And I think that's probably about on par with what you just described. It's certainly been our experience, but I will also say the more diversified you are, the greater, if you're doing herbs and carrots and summer crops, winter crops, and all that grows exponentially.
Yes.
Because they're looking at, you pick 3 to 4 crops.
Yeah.
1 acre, about 40 hours.
That's probably about where we're at, with just right at half an acre of garden, and 2 of us working full-time jobs, but then evenings and weekends, it's 20 hours, 25 hours a week,
Right.
and we're growing probably 20 different crops, and a variety, small CSA, and lots of choices for our customers over the season.
Yeah.
And we do grow the things we like, except for kale, which we grow because the CSA has to grow kale, and we don't like it.
There's 2 other considerations I would throw out there. One would be, are you trying to supply different items every single week of your season, or do you want to do something like sweet potatoes? You plant them once, you basically ignore them, and then you dig them up in October.
Right.
So that's one option. So that's fairly, digging them takes a while, but it's not very labor intensive throughout most of the season. Versus if you want to supply salad greens every single week, that means you've got to be planting at least every other week to have a continuous rotation, and then you're going to be cutting those, and then you're probably going to need to wash them, and then you're going to need to put them in bags, and then you're going to need to put them in the cooler, and then you're going to have to think about how you transport those. So your crop selection can really play a part in how much time and what part of the season you're going to be busiest at.
Pumpkins, gourds, squash, all, plant, take care of them, and then harvest all in one time. We used to do sweet corn, and from the middle of, my wife's nodding her head, she was there. We'd be out there before daylight starting to do the harvest, get that taken to the stores, and then we'd go home, take a nap, and then go back in the evening and get more sweet from 20-something of July all the way through August. And that was pretty intense. So, the pumpkins were a lot easier.
But all those solid bars of gold you have now, it all paid off, right?
No, we have six children, and most of them have gardens, and we've got 22 grandchildren, 25 great-grandchildren. But those kids, when they were at home, they all learned how to work. They learned to get out there and do things, and so now we've got grandchildren to help us and great-grandchildren coming on.
So that's the real secret nobody
That's
wants
the
to
real
talk about.
secret.
Lots of kids. That's
right.
These guys are on it. They got that
Somebody
taken
else
care
is-
of.
Yeah.
We got
Okay.
8, so we're on it.
Good. Good. Well, you have to talk to her as far as the management part's concerned.
Duct tape and a taser fix it. Manual labor.
Except they eat more.
Yeah.
They do.
Any other questions, comments on the floor? Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for all you've done.